Hello, everybody. Today we're tackling a subject that strikes at the very core of what it means to live or not to live in a democracy. The events of September 11th, 2001 reshaped the world as we know it. But almost immediately after the attacks, a group of dedicated researchers began questioning the official version of events. Over the years, what started as a small effort grew into the 9/11 Truth Movement, a coalition that includes former government officials, head of state, leading business figures, scholars, and even artists, from actors and musicians to filmmakers and comedians. Some call the September 11th attacks the original sin of the 21st century, an event that has been exploited time and again to justify wars, surveillance, and unprecedented political power. It's been like the proverbial gift that keeps on giving for the elites who benefited from the fallout. The movement also includes experts like architects and engineers, such as our friend Richard Gage, whom we've had the opportunity to interview. So stick around as we dive into the thorny subject of who might really be behind the 9/11 attacks and explore the questions that still haunt this tragic chapter in history. So welcome, Patrick.
Hi.
Can you just start by telling us what you learned when we interviewed Richard Gage a month ago or so? Why is there such a cover-up in the press about the explosive evidence?
Well, it's really amazing. We did two hour-long interviews with Richard Gage, architect. I had interviewed him for my BitChute channel a couple years ago, and he is one of many architects and engineers that say that those three buildings couldn't have fallen without explosives. And most people in the world know about the Twin Towers, but even New Yorkers, they don't know about the fact that there was a third building, Building 7, that collapsed. It was 57 stories high. It was the width of an entire city block. Most cities, it would be the tallest building in the city. Of course, it didn't look that big next to the Twin Towers, but it came down in 6 seconds. And it was a complete cover-up about Building 7. So he's looking at the fact that it's a structural and scientific and physical impossibility for these three buildings to have exploded, pancake down just from fires. And he is one of the main names now that we associate with the 9/11 Truth Movement. And you mentioned about there being a cover-up. There absolutely has been a cover-up, because now after September 11th, we didn't really know what was happening. But now we've figured out all the evidence is in, and every part of the official September 11th account has been shown to be false. I think what it is, Holly, is that if the world were to know the truth about September 11th, it would undermine faith in the institutions and the very idea of democracy itself. And people would start questioning even more. But obviously, it's very important, because these same people that carried it out, these criminals, are still involved in governance of the United States, and they're directing policy. And before September 11th, there was a peace process on the table for the Palestinian situation, and that was all destroyed after September 11th. So I think, like so many things, there is a cover-up because of the implications. They can't let people believe, and they can't let people know the truth, or they would have a revolution on their hands. The implications would be radical.
Oh yeah, thank you, Patrick, for bringing those insights from our interview with Richard Gage. As a Muslim, an Arab, and an Egyptian, I feel compelled to address a narrative that has been deeply troubling to me and to many others from my community. From the very beginning, the events of September 11th have been used to paint a broad and unfair picture of Muslims as inherently violent and complicit in terrorism. It's really heartbreaking that millions of peaceful Muslims around the world People who live their lives guided by principles of peace, family, and community have been unfairly associated with such an atrocity. Islam, at its core, promotes mercy and justice, values that stand in direct opposition to the horror we witnessed on that day. The tragedy of 9/11 was a crime against humanity, not the act of a religion or an entire people. Yet the narrative that emerged from those events has justified wars in Muslim-majority countries, fostered Islamophobia, and inflicted emotional and psychological trauma on countless innocent Muslims around the world. It's essential to remember that many Muslims were also victims on that day, whether in the towers or among the first responders who rushed to help. Muslims condemned the attack unequivocally, yet we have often found ourselves on the receiving end of suspicion, discrimination, and violence. You know, Patrick, today as we question the official narrative and explore alternative perspectives, it's not just about finding the truth, it's also about reclaiming our voice and saying we refuse to be scapegoated for something. So am I using the word correctly?
Yes, scapegoated is exactly the right word. Muslims were an easy target because for whatever historical reasons, that was a narrative that was going to fly. In fact, it was all very planned in advance.
So we refuse to be scapegoated for something we had no part in. The fight for truth and accountability isn't just about justice for those who lost their lives that day, but also about protecting the dignity of people who continue to be unfairly blamed.
Can I say something though? The Muslim community, I think, has really, they've accepted the narrative and they've said, well, these are extremists that don't really represent Islam. And for the most part, the leadership of the Muslim community has been more than comfortable scapegoating Muslims because they say, well, those terrorists, they don't represent us. Whereas I think what a more honest approach would be like we're doing, where we're going at the very underbelly of the narrative itself and saying, no, this is a crime of empire, this is a crime of American imperialism, and Muslims had nothing to do with it. And so with all the books that have been written about Islamic fundamentalists, even from Muslim sources, they miss this key, crucial ingredient.
So what's false flag terrorism? Where does this term come from?
Well, literally in ancient times when ships would fly flags, and they would fly the flags of their enemies and then carry out atrocities so that popular opposition would be mobilized to a predetermined group. So the United States has a dirty history of committing false flag terrorism, where they'll bomb ships, they'll bomb villages, they'll set bombs off in shopping centers and railway stations to blame it on the official enemies that change like flavor of the month. But some people say, well, the United States would never do something like this. Well, we have done false flag terrorism going back over 100 years, and September 11th wasn't the first or the last example of it, but it comes from literally this idea that you fly the flag of your enemy. So you go and you do something so that then hatred and opposition can be mobilized against your enemy. And certainly the United States and France and England, they have enough Arabs working in their intelligence services that they can say, go stand in the corner with a bomb at any time and they can take the blame. Then they say, we never knew him. It's a very old trick in the book, but there's a lot of evidence, and including documentary evidence, showing that they're doing this.
You know, for those who want scholarly resources, consult the book of Dr. David Ray Griffin. I understand you met Dr. David Ray Griffin.
Consult the books of Dr. David Ray Griffin. He's written over 15 books about September 11th. Now
he passed away a year or so ago.
Yeah.
So this man inspired so many, including Richard Gage. Griffin had written 20 books on the philosophy of science before turning his massive attention to the attacks of September 11th.
Yeah, well, this is true. Some people say that those who form the 9/11 Truth Movement don't know anything about evidence, but actually, David Griffin was he specialized in what was scientific evidence, and um, I did meet him. I met him at an event in Portland, Oregon. He was on a book tour and he gave a talk. Now he focuses his books on September 11th and his laser beam intelligence, and he's inspired so many. But there are others like Muslim scholar Dr. Kevin Barrett who write about false flag terrorism in general. Although we want to focus today on September 11th, but there are great resources, books written by first-rate scholars, and the fact that they're unknown, and now a lot of them actually out of print. This is a scandal because I thought that we lived in an environment where truth ruled the day, and if scholars present evidence that we're being lied to about an event, then the world should know about it, and it's up to the rest of us to continue to push this into the public consciousness. The books by David Ray Griffin are so well researched. He's researched every aspect of the September 11th attack, as have others. Yeah, it was really an inspiration meeting him. And of course, he formed the group Muslim Christian Alliance along with Dr. Kevin Barrett. And he felt that as Christians, it's necessary to speak out, especially as Americans. We're in the belly of the beast, and so we have a responsibility.
Yeah, sometimes we hear from the left, even the peace movement, that September 11th doesn't matter because the empire's crimes are so out in the open. How do you respond to something like this?
Well, this is actually, something I heard a lot because I was coming out of the anti-war movement, and I thought it was necessary to go to the root cause of the war in Iraq. And a lot of even the people on the left, these structures that come out of the protests against the Vietnam War, the environmental movement, and all that, they don't want to have anything to do with the September 11th Truth Movement. It could be argued that they were actually instrumental in squashing it. And now here we are today, over 20 years later, and the September 11th Truth Movement is considered a right-wing phenomenon. Although at the time in 2003, 2004, it was considered kind of a fringe left-wing phenomenon. But now it's considered right-wing. And so it's really unfortunate. And it's led to the situation where we are today. And Trump is part of this, where the United States is very divided and people are divided along ideological lines. And there's a lot of anger. We had an opportunity to come together, and if the truth about September 11th had been pushed into the public consciousness when we really had the chance, then everything we've seen since then, these power grabs, the surveillance, would have been stopped. And so what we're looking at with the left, the peace movement, is controlled opposition. They act as gatekeepers, keeping people from going too far. And it's really unfortunate because there's so many magazines and radio shows that form part of the alternative media, but for the most part, they've ignored the story.
Couldn't you say it's just the chickens coming home to roost? I mean, after all, the US intelligence armed al-Qaeda in order to fight the Soviets. The US funded both sides of the Iraq-Iran war. Doesn't the US policy just create a condition where these kinds of disasters keep happening without needing to say they are planning and orchestrating them directly? I find it boggles the imagination how members of the Bush administration could sit around planning to kill so many thousands of Americans. Wouldn't somebody have talked, blown the whistle?
Well, you have to look at the kind of people we're dealing with. We're dealing with ultimately a drug cartel that's very dedicated to selling cocaine and heroin. And they've killed millions of people around the world. The Bush administration killed millions of people in Latin America during the 70s and 80s. So it's not beyond their capacity to do this. And what you're saying is true, that the chickens do come home to roost and there is something of blowback for US policy. But ultimately, we have to go with what the evidence says. And the evidence is very clear that obviously Muslims didn't have anything to do with September 11th. The explosions in the building, that's just one aspect of the September 11th attack. But we have proof. We have proof that it was the United States government. Like I said, some of the best scholars in the world, legal minds, they've made a very, very strong case. And anybody who looks at September 11th becomes aware of the fact that it was carried out by the United States government. On my BitChute channel, I have dozens of documentary films about September 11th. And there's no evidence to support the government's version of events. You know, one example of just how silly it is, they named Mohammed Atta as the ringleader of the September 11th attacks. And they said they were able to identify him because somehow his passport survived all the rubble and flew out of the trade center and landed intact on the street. I mean, they're making this stuff up as they went along. 5 or 6 of the hijackers have turned up alive around the world. They saw their names and their images on TV, and they've turned up alive and even did interviews with major news organizations. I mean, there's a sort of circular reasoning that goes on because the public depends on the intelligence agencies to provide information about these kinds of crimes, and yet it's the intelligence agencies that are carrying out the crimes. The fox is guarding the hen house. And when there are state crimes against democracy, investigations into these crimes are highly controlled, tightly framed, and totally reliant on the institutions and organizations that stand to be embarrassed by such investigations.
Some people use the phrase conspiracy theory. You talk, though, about crime, particularly state crimes against democracy.
Yeah, the term conspiracy theory was invented by the CIA. We actually have the memo. It's been declassified where they sent this memo to all their agents in the media saying that they wanted to denigrate those that offered an alternative version of the Kennedy assassination. And they were going to denigrate them by using the term conspiracy theory. And before the Kennedy assassination, the term conspiracy theory doesn't appear in print. It started because of this. And there's, again, a kind of circular reasoning. There's a quotation, it's an adaptation of Shakespeare, but it says, "Why does treason never prosper? Because when it prospers, it's not called treason." So there's all sorts of crimes that we accept to happen in society, and they're not called conspiracies because we accept them as crimes. In court in the United States, the term conspiracy is frequently used, but it means the same thing as crime. And so there's lots of evidence of crimes in American history. So the way that the term conspiracy theory is used, it means automatically that it's something that's not true. And often people imagine that you assume your conclusion and then based on purely political considerations. But I think that crime is a more accurate term to use, especially when we're talking about state crimes against democracy. But it's hard to do because of something in the American psyche that has faith in the institutions themselves and faith in the United States government. But there's been all sorts of things that have been denigrated at first as conspiracy theory, but then the media has to say, no, actually, it was true.
So how did September 11th change the world geopolitically?
Well, at the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, the world was really going into a situation where we were looking at peace. There was a peace process on the table for the Palestinians. The problem was, at the end of the Cold War, there wasn't a way to justify the continued budgets for the arms company, and this, because during the Cold War we had been in this arms race, and they needed a new crisis. They needed a new enemy, and they wrote about this in their documents. Like the Project for the American Century, where a group of neocons, as they're called because of their ideology, said that they wanted to rebuild America's defenses, but they needed to have a crisis like a new Pearl Harbor. But going back to what you said earlier, Holly, about it boggles your mind that members of the Bush administration could just be sitting around planning this. You look at people like Dick Cheney and the CIA. They're very secretive, and the kinds of businesses that were run out of the World Trade Center and the connection with money laundering. They had to do this for their survival. We've had researchers research all the financial aspects of September 11th, and then it becomes very obvious why they would want to do this. They shut down the New York stock market in the event, and then there was a bunch of trading that was made, trading in Chicago. They had their stock transactions planned in advance. They made a lot of money with insurance for the buildings. And something like this, there's many, many different angles, but we're not talking about sane people. We're talking about a group of narco traffickers and people that are very dedicated to this idea, Maoist idea of permanent revolution, a new American century. They wanted to put satellites in space, start a space race, and in order to control the world, they needed this kind of a reason for being.
Okay, so tell us about the project for the new American century.
Yeah, so the 2000 election that got George Bush II into power, it was very controversial. In fact, the Supreme Court of the United States stepped in and declared George Bush the winner before all the votes had been counted. But there was a group that the previous year had called themselves the Project for the New American Century, and they then became the Bush administration. And they wrote that all these things they wanted to do, controlling the world for the entire century, but they said they needed a new and cataclysming event like a new Pearl Harbor, and they admitted that they needed these terrorist attacks in order for it to go forward. So I've never seen motives. I don't know what makes these people tick. All I see are the actions. And so ultimately, we have to look at the facts, and the facts show us that, yes, the entire apparatus of the United States leadership, both parties, Republicans and Democrats, were to blame. The Democrats, because after this evidence came out, they didn't want to say anything. And now the irony again is that September 11th truth movement is now characterized as a right-wing phenomenon.
Yeah, exactly. You're reminding me, like, it's really ridiculous what the official accounts are saying about Muhammad Atta. And that reminds me, like, how about Danielle Hopsker's research into Muhammad Atta, the supposed ringleader?
This was one of the most incredible books dealing with September 11th. Not only Welcome to Terrorland by Daniel Hopsicker, but also Barry and the Boys by Daniel Hopsicker, the story of Barry Seals, the drug trafficking. But Daniel Hopsicker went to Venice, Florida. His parents lived there, so he had a place to stay, and he started researching. He got in touch with Mohammed Atta's ex-girlfriend, and he wrote about it in the book Welcome to Terrorland. And Mohammed Atta was not Muslim. According to his stripper girlfriend, he ate pork, he snorted cocaine. And okay, so we're told that Mohammed Atta died in the attack. He was known as the ringleader. We've all seen his face 100 times on TV, you know, the 1,000-yard stare. And Daniel Hopsicker found out that just 3 weeks after Mohammed Atta arrived on July 3rd, 2000, to attend the flight school at Huffman Aviation in Venice, Florida, the owner of the flight school, Wally Hilliard, had his Learjet surrounded by DEA agents with submachine guns on the runway of Orlando Executive Airport because there were 43 pounds of heroin on board. Then they let them go. Often what we see is that lower level DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency agents, get news of a drug shipment, and then they arrest the people, but then they realize that, oh no, those guys are actually working for their bosses. And that's one of the big takeaways of burying the boys. But it shows that Mohammed Atta didn't come out of nowhere. He was working in this whole environment and nexus of CIA drug dealing, and there were other drug busts with tons of cocaine associated with Huffman Aviation, even after September 11th, where they just let the people go. And this should have been the biggest story of the 21st century. There were other people that said they saw Mohammed Atta at Air Force parties. So there's definitely a connection between Mohammed Atta and these airports where they were trafficking for drugs. And, you know, we've talked before about how the Bush family and the Clinton families were up to their necks in narco trafficking. And this is another hijacked narrative because it shows that without knowing the criminal background of these people in charge, Americans and people throughout the world don't have a context to understand the kind of people that we're dealing with.
What can people do about it?
Well, you know, there's an interesting phrase: think globally, act locally. So you got to have realistic.
Think globally, act locally.
Yeah, you got to have realistic ideas about what you can accomplish. So for me and for you, changing the world, that's not a realistic goal. However, influencing our community, that totally is. So you can share these reports, inform yourself.
So even though the American media and American politicians said this isn't a war on Islam, it really is, in my opinion. We're talking about the war on terror here. A war we are told can be forever because there is no declared enemy.
Yeah, you can't have a war against the concept, war on terrorism. But if we were honest, we realize that terrorists are close to home. The terrorists are our neighbors and our family members that work in the military-industrial complex.
Okay, so that's the end of our episode. So thank you very much, Patrick. And if you liked it, please subscribe.
Yes, please subscribe and check out my show on BitChute and share these reports. Thank you very much.
See you next time. Bye-bye.